Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and you are in for such a treat today. I am so excited about the guest who is with me, and I want to welcome Michael Neill.
Hello.
Michael, welcome to my show.
Thank you very much.
Well, this is going to be just a wonderful conversation. I know, Michael, many of my listeners may already be familiar with you, but for those who aren't, I want to give them an idea about the special conversation they're about to be a part of. Michael is internationally renowned as a transformative teacher, author, broadcaster, and speaker. He's authored 6 best-selling books, including 2 that I have right here, and I love them both and highly recommend them. The first is The Inside Out Revolution, and I think it's been translated into, 25 languages?
We're up to 26.
Michael? 26?
Languages, yeah.
It's an amazing book. And the other one is Creating the Impossible. So if you have a big project or a lofty goal, I highly recommend that you get this book. It's been amazing as an inspiration for me. I love the way Michael writes, and he not only is a great writer, he's an amazing speaker. And I want to encourage you all to listen to or watch actually 2 of his TEDx talks. Why aren't we awesomer? And can a TEDx talk really change the world? And in addition, I've become a huge fan of his podcast, which is called Caffeine for the Soul. And I've told Michael, really, for me, this is more calming for the soul, because the ideas, Michael, you share in that podcast are inspiring to me, and yet they are so reassuring. And that's part of what I think we'll be talking about today.
I like to think they're calming to the mind.
Yes.
Enlivening for the soul.
Oh, that's a great way to say it. Yes. Yes. Perfect. I'm so glad you added that, because I love my coffee in the morning. And so I like that enlivening part. And it really does do both. It's very calming to the mind. Thank you. So speaking of the mind, I know this is one of your very favorite topics. And of course, as part of our minds is the thinking that goes with it. And your whole book, The Inside Out Revolution, is around this whole helping us gain greater awareness of that. So I would love for you to just share a little bit as we start out the premise behind the Inside Out Revolution.
Well, I talk about it in different ways in the book, and depending on who I'm speaking to, but effectively, the big realization that I had, that people have, I mean, I wasn't the first person to have the realization, is we are effectively, and my kids love this because it's all like, we're living in a simulation. But it's not like a simulation controlled by AI, evil computers, or bots. It's the nature of the mind that when we think things, they appear real to us. Now, there's some thoughts that we know are thoughts, like, well, that's just like the little chatter we have inside our head. But we're actually living in a world of thought, and we feel that world as if it's the world that we're experiencing. Now, I do understand that sounds nuts, right? But most people can kind of get a sense of it when they start noticing how quickly a day can go from beautiful to terrible, or terrible to beautiful, when nothing's really changed, but a new thought came into your head. You know, in a way, you're always never more than one thought away from sadness and despair and fear. And you're never more than one thought away from peace and happiness and well-being. So we can kind of see how we're living in an experience of thought, but it just looks so much like we're living in an experience of the world. The only way we can change our experience is to change the world. That would be an outside in. If I can fix what's out there, then I'll be okay. And when you start to see that everything comes from nothing, that everything comes via thought into being, then suddenly it doesn't look like the world out there needs to change for you to be yourself, to be okay, to be creative, to be effective, to be impactful. And you start to realize you have a lot more freedom and autonomy than it often looks like you have when it looks like the world is leading you around by the nose.
I had the opportunity just today to speak with someone, and because of reading your books and really absorbing this idea that our thoughts create our world, I was listening to this person as he was describing his situation, and it was all created by his thoughts. And he was feeling stuck and with no choice. And I'm not able to do this. I'm not able to do that. And it was asking some of those same questions that you ask in your books for us to consider in stepping back and taking a look at what really is going on here.
Mm.
And I'd love for you to share, what are some of the things that a person might ask themselves to become more aware of the fact that our thoughts are driving how we see the world?
Well, for me, it's often easier to see when you're not looking quite so hard. Like, in other words, so I was speaking to a relatively new client today, and she wants to grow her business. And she was talking about how every time she sees other people in her industry doing well, she panics. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Because for me, and I'm not saying I'm right either, but like when I see people in my industry doing well, I think, oh, good. Like the industry must be doing well. Um, and she was talking about how she felt behind, and and other people's success looked threatening to her. Now, I I thought, okay, so it sounds like you think you're in a race because you're behind, apparently, and and that other people winning is threatening to you. So it's like a death race, like where if you don't finish in the top five, you're like in Squid Games, like you're killed or something. And when I pointed it out to her, it took her a minute to realize, oh, that's not true. Like it is in her reality. Like that's the way she's thought about business and competition, unexamined, like not on purpose, but it just never, she didn't realize that wasn't what's real. That was her thought created reality. Well, the beautiful thing about a thought created reality is it can change like that. Now, I didn't tell her, so don't think that, think this, because that would just be my thought created reality. What I found is really helpful to people is when they start to see how much of what they're experiencing is what they've made up, they can stop making it up. And then the mind has this amazing ability to bring something better when you make space for it. Like the intelligence behind the brain will deliver things that you've never thought of. And most people who are successful at all in business have experiences of that, but they probably felt random or lucky. Like, oh yeah, I mean, I did. I mean, the whole business came because I just had this idea in the shower one day. Or, oh yeah, I mean, we had this huge problem, and then suddenly Bob in engineering had an idea that out of the blue, and like we know that happens, but we don't rely on it. And so when you start to see how powerful the mind is, Shakespeare, I think, was the one who said, can make a heaven out of hell and a hell of heaven. Then you start to realize, oh, I've got a lot more freedom of movement than I thought I did. There's a lot more scope to create inside of my world, but also to just create a bigger world to play in. People really shrink the world down to their size and then try to be successful in that world. But the world's way bigger than you. And if you're open to it, opportunities start showing up. A lot of people have maybe heard about, cross industry, that if you're looking for fresh ideas, look to a different industry. It's the idea behind mastermind groups, whether they're organized or not, where you talk to leaders in other industries because A, it's non-competitive, so you feel freer to speak openly, but B, because often the ideas in one industry it's not occurred to anybody in your industry to use what they do in a manufacturing firm, or to do what they might do in filmmaking, but suddenly when you're not convinced, nope, this is it, this is how this business is, and I've got to figure out how to make it work inside this little box, well then, yeah, your ideas aren't going to be huge and they're not going to be groundbreaking, but the possibility is always there, and it's really close at hand.
So if someone is feeling pressure or fear, which tends to, as you so well, put it so well, it tends to shrink our ability to be creative. It's hard to feel that creativity when we're feeling that pressure on us. What is something that someone can do to shift so that that creativity is more available to them?
Well, the first thing that I invariably will ask somebody in that situation is, and I'll ask them to be honest, like, because most people know the right answer, but I'll ask them, do you think that pressure is conducive to creative, effective action in the workplace? And I would say about 50% of the people I talk to say yes. They say, well, you can have too much of it, but some pressure is good. Now, as long as you think that, no technique I could possibly give you is going to get you to give up pressure, because you think pressure is good. Maybe you'd like a little less of it. Like I used to do a thing with worry, where I would say to clients, if I could wave a magic wand and make it so that you could never worry again, would you want me to wave the magic wand? And in years of asking that question, nobody ever said yes. The closest to yes they came is, well, I mean, I'd like to worry less, because at some level, people think worry keeps me safe or worry motivates me. And people think, no, pressure helps me focus. Pressure keeps me on track. Pressure pushes me. But the reality is, pressure isn't the bit that moves you, it's focus. And sometimes pressure helps us focus, but you can focus without pressure. You can up your presence without a feeling of pressure. Pressure is 100% interference, 0% motivation, drive, creative, or any of the things that we think it's going to do for us. And so until somebody can see that, getting rid of it's not going to happen. Like, they'll get relief. You can get relief by breathing and thinking about something else for a minute. But you'll then bring it back up. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is people need to see that pressure is not a property of a situation. Pressure is a property of the mind. It's a property of thought. So one of my favorite examples, a couple of Olympics ago, I can't remember which one it was, but it might have been the London Olympics even, but I was watching the Olympics and I was watching the synchronized diving, which I had never seen before, but I got really hooked on it that year. And the top three teams were the Americans, the Chinese, and the Brits. And when they interviewed the Americans about how they handled the pressure, they were really like, oh, we have a mind coach, and they do hypnosis exercise with us, and we listen to kind of visualizations before we go to settle us, and we have all these great things we do to take away the pressure. And when they interviewed the British divers, it was actually funny because the interviewer didn't know what to do with herself because they just kept going, what pressure? She said, but you're here in front of millions, hundreds of millions of people. I go, well, not really. We're here in front of however many people are in the stadium, but we dive in stadiums all the time. That's what we do. We're professional, not professional, but we're Olympic athletes. That's the gig. And you could see the interviewers like, well, but I mean, it's everything rides on this dive. And they go, well, I mean, not really. I mean, obviously we want to dive well, but I mean, nothing rides on the. I mean, we want to be safe, and she couldn't get them to pressure themselves. Now, I don't know if they'd had amazing coaching or they just happened to kind of figure it out themselves, but they did not need to handle or manage pressure because they didn't create it in the first place.
Hmm.
Now, what was really, I've told that story before, and I've had people go, well, yeah, but they got the bronze. They didn't get the gold. And I point out that's because the other two teams had better divers, right? It's not, more pressure wouldn't have made them better. Being better divers would have made them better. They were really good. I mean, third in the world, still pretty good. But we confuse, we start to think that pressure, because saying that, well, I mean, I always feel pressure before a big presentation, and my presentations tend to go really well. So the pressure is part of that, is like saying, well, there are always fire trucks around fires. So I think fire trucks probably cause fires. And there's always umbrellas in the rain. So I think umbrellas are pretty, like, they evoke rain because you always see them together. It's like, that's not how it works. It is how it looks if you don't understand it. But that's the whole misunderstanding that the Inside Out Revolution is pointing to. Because often we'll have certain thoughts and experiences in certain situations, we think the situation is causing the thoughts and experiences. But it actually works the opposite way. We experience thought and then project it. So I sometimes use the metaphor of a film. So, I mean, I have a client who still has a 35 millimeter Hollywood projector system. So, where the old film runs. It's fun going to his place to watch movies because he gets all the first cut movies in 35 millimeter. So imagine one of those old style projectors. So the projector is the mind. Like, the mind is not a camera that receiving what's really happening. The mind is the projector. Our consciousness is the screen, and the film is thought. And so you could also say the light is like attention. So the light of the projector brings illuminates thought, the film, and we have a screen and we see it, and then we react as if what's up on the screen is really happening. So if there are monsters, we feel scared. If people seem to be having a nice time, we feel warm and fuzzy. If sad things are happening, terrible things, and people are losing, we feel sad. But when we go to a movie theater, we know it's a movie. We don't think there's something we need to fix up on the screen. We know that if we wait a minute, there'll be another movie. Right? That's why we like movies. Well, our minds work exactly the same, except that because we don't recognize that it's a movie, we think, no, everything is a documentary. Everything is real. Life can look really overwhelming and really scary. And it feels, what's the point of even trying? Because I can't change that. Well, look, it's true. Like, I can't stop the girl in Psycho from being stabbed by the guy on the screen. Fortunately, it's not really happening outside of the movie. Like, I have a client who directed the movie Hitchcock, which was about Alfred Hitchcock. And he invited me on set. He said, do you want to see, we're going to film the shower scene with Scarlett Johansson. And I'm like, of course I want to come watch you film the shower scene with Scarlett. Like, what are you saying? It was the least sexy thing I think I have ever done. There's like 150 people on set, probably not that many. and there's, people smoking cigarettes and all right, yeah, and there's like all this equipment around and and it's like, oh yeah, it when you see it on screen, it looks, oh, but when you see, oh, this is all manufactured, then it's kind of interesting and it's kind of cool, but it's not scary.
Mhm. I want to uh, throw out an example here. Imagine, because I'm thinking of different leaders that I speak to all the time, and many of them are under the gun, right? They have time constraints, they have a lot of different projects they're responsible for. So they do feel that pressure. And you're saying that it's, created in our minds. How can they shift from seeing it as, well, my boss is wanting this, my team is wanting that, I feel like I am under a lot of pressure? How do you respond to that concern?
So firstly, I make sure that they know that I'm not diminishing their experience and saying, oh, it's just your thinking, because that's not the point. We're all living in the same equipment. But the first thing I'd probably point out is there's a difference between there being time constraints and being under the gun, right? Being under the gun sounds scary. That sounds like, oh shit, if I get this wrong, I'm going to be shot. Now, they would say, oh, yeah, yeah, it's just a metaphor. But no, that's your experience. You're experiencing being under the gun.
Mhm.
Now, my guess is if they were really under the gun, they wouldn't be free to talk to you about it. Right? What they mean is there's a lot going on, and I probably feel overwhelmed at the thought of how much there is to do in the time. And my thinking is probably spinning. Like, oh God, I got to do this and I got to do this. And I'm stacking things as if I have to do everything at the same time. And I start to feel under pressure, overwhelmed. But but if I just didn't think that, all there ever is to do is whatever's next. Like right now, my only job is to talk to you. I may have 17 other jobs when I leave here, but it does me or you no good for me to be thinking about them while I'm with you. Now, there is, when it comes to that, something I found very helpful as a distinction, and it's between overwhelm and overload. So, overwhelm is a feeling. Overwhelm is that feeling like there's so much to do and not enough time to do it. That disappears when you stop thinking it. Overload is where you genuinely have more to do than you have time and capacity to do. And overload can only be managed by lightening the load. You're going to have to make choices. You're going to have to shift priorities. So I was sharing a story the other day I hadn't thought of for years, but about 12 years ago, I gave a workshop for a company in Australia, in Sydney. And it seemed to be going down well, except for with one woman in the room. It was clearly not going down well with her. So in the first break, I went over to her and I said, do you mind telling me what's going on? Because it looks like you hate me. And she said, oh, well, she said, she was very nice, but she said, look, there's no way I can see with some things how thought might be a factor, but there's no way you could tell me that you could do my job and not feel pressure and stress. And I said, well, tell me about your job. And so she drew an org chart. And essentially what had happened is two companies had merged, her company and another large international company. And they, for some reason, kept both CEOs, but kept her as COO of both. So she now was responsible for more than twice as many people with two different bosses who did not agree about how things should go down. And as she was describing it, I started to feel stressed. And I started thinking, oh, maybe I'm wrong. But then at a certain point, I burst out laughing and said, okay, I can honestly tell you I would not feel any pressure or stress in your job. And she said, why not? And I said, because it's impossible. So I wouldn't be trying to do it like that. I would know I can't do that. And I would look at how can I contribute to the success of this company? Because even if that's my official job description, it's never going to happen. I worked with another guy. He was the head of a film studio. And he was overwhelmed and he was struggling. And, and so they sent him to work with me for a few days to see if I could, help him settle. And he was a brilliant, brilliant guy. And I asked him, tell me about your day. And he said, well, okay, the car comes from the studio to pick me up at 7. And they hand me an iPad that's preloaded with the rushes from all the films. We sometimes have like as many as 24 films filming at the same time. So on the way in, it takes about an hour to get in. So I go through all that. And then I have meetings all day. And then I go from, I have meetings, I have 2 levels of meeting. I have meetings in my office, and then I have meetings on my way to meetings. So if it's not as important, they have a meeting on the way to the meeting. And then when I get back in the car at 6, and then I have the iPad again to go through things. And I'm like, do you get any breaks? And he said, I've learned how to get 1 break a day, sometimes 2. I call my wife, and they all, for some reason, just respect that they can't bother me when I'm talking to my wife. And I don't actually talk to my wife because I'm so freaking stressed. I just have her on the line, and so everyone will leave me alone for a bit and I get a break. Now, what I basically pointed out to him over the course of the days is, yeah, this isn't a you problem. Nobody's going to perform well under those conditions. So this isn't about you finding another gear. This is about you redesigning your workload in a way that's manageable. Now, when you're overwhelmed, it's difficult to know if you're also overloaded. So you actually have to calm down first before you can look clean and see, do I really need to make changes? Because sometimes you do. Or is it just a case of I've been winding myself up and getting caught up? And if I can take a little time to settle and a little time to pull back, I can carry on and it's fine.
How did he respond to that?
Really well. he actually wound up going to another film studio and running a different film studio where he could set it up the way he wanted, and is doing well. Still making movies.
Yeah, that's such an important point there that you're making here all throughout. But this idea that looking at what is within our own control in terms of our thinking, but also our actions.
Yeah.
And making a change if we've adjusted our thinking and looking from the inside out, and still the environment is creating situations that we just can't function in.
So can I share another story?
Sure.
So one of the places where I first saw this, and it was reported to me by the CEO. I didn't, it was not my coaching. It was actually one of my mentor's clients. And he was running a defense contracting firm. So they made they made parts for fighter jets and other military things. And so a very large company, and they were, their number one client was the government, and the military. So and this was during the Iraq War, and it mattered. Like people's lives were at stake. And so the government instituted a program where essentially they said, we need this particular thing completed, but it has to be done in 9 months. It was normally an 18-month build, and it has to be done to spec. Like there's no wiggle room, and it has to be done to roughly the budget that had been agreed. And no, that's impossible, right? You don't just suddenly cut your manufacturing time in half. But these are the brightest and the best. He had guys from Caltech and MIT and Stanford. They're great people there. And so he said for about 2 weeks, he and the engineers just racked their brains to figure out how to cut the manufacturing time down in half. And the closest they got was something that would cut it down to a year, but it would take about a year to retool the factories to enable them to implement. So it would actually not save time at all. And so one day, he just saw how everybody was getting more and more downhearted, more and more exhausted. And he called it. He said at the end of one day, he said, look, I'm going to call the general tomorrow morning. I'm going to take the hit. This is on me. And go home, like get some sleep. I'll see you on Monday. And so he does, he's sort of gotten to that point where he just recognizes, okay, I'm not going to kill my team so that we can keep this contract. And even if it means I'm out, I'll live. So he comes in the next morning. He always came in at 6 a.m. and he was usually the first person there. And he's surprised to see there's some other cars there. And waiting by the front door is one of the engineers. And he goes, what are you doing here? Guys, come on. And they take him, and there's like 4 of the engineers there. And he goes, what's going on? And I'm going to make up the guy's name was Bob. I don't know what the guy's name was. And Bob, the engineer, says, well, to be honest, when you said that we're going to be giving up and going home, I was so relieved that I didn't really just think about what it meant to you. I was just like, oh, I went home and like, I'm talking to my wife and like, I'm happy for the first time in ages. And we had a great night. And, I played with the kids and he said, I woke up at like 2 a.m. and I had this idea that we haven't completely different than anything we talked about that might actually work. And I thought, you know what? I owe it to you, to at least test it. So I came into the office and Charlene was already here because the same thing happened to her. And her idea was a little different, but similar. And then 2 other engineers showed up. And anyways, we think we cracked it. And it turned out they had. And they actually completed the project couple days early to spec and pulled it off. But here was the thing. The CEO understood this. He called it state of mind. And he understood how much of a difference state of mind makes to performance. So he absolutely insisted that they proceed without that sense of pressure. So the general comes out at a certain point in the process to kind of see how things are going. And he goes around and everyone's carrying on and working. And he goes into the CEO's office and he goes, all right, spill. And the CEO goes, what do you mean? And he said, I have been going around the country at all the facilities involved in this project. And every facility, people are running around like their hair is on fire. And here, everybody's just getting on with it. What's going on? And so the CEO tried to explain to him about thought and state of mind, and it didn't go down. The general said, well, whatever you're doing, just carry on. Well, so when the project was completed, they celebrated and he said his proudest thing wasn't that they'd completed the project. It was that everyone on the team said, we could do it again, because they hadn't completed it by killing themselves. Mm-hmm. They hadn't completed it by putting so much pressure on themselves and going until they were ready to collapse. And so that's the power of what can be accomplished when you use creativity and focus instead of pressure and stress to move forward.
Oh, I love that. Such a powerful story. And I know this happens to people on a much smaller scale. Oh, yeah. When they step back or even give up on something. And then all of a sudden the idea pops into their heads when they're no longer forcing and pushing and putting pressure on.
Follow up to the story. He wound up leaving the company a number of years later and coming back from time to time as a consultant. And he said one of the first times he came back, he ran into Bob, the engineer, who was now Bob, the head of engineering. And they were catching up and he asked Bob, because he knew that the state of mind trainings that they'd done weren't going on anymore. And he said, what stuck from that time? And Bob said, well, we've now instituted giving up as part of our engineering strategy. And he said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we actually, like, if somebody's stuck on something, we'll go, well, have you given up yet? And like, oh, I forgot. Yeah, I'll go. And he said, not only do he said, the weird thing is it works every time. They get fresh ideas every time, but they're surprised every time. Like, even though they know it's how it works, it so doesn't look like it should work that way that they're still surprised.
There's such an important lesson for my listeners who are in leadership roles when they're pushing or they're feeling that we've got to drive, we've got to figure this out, and taking that very heavy, serious approach versus lightening up, letting go, and see, what happens as a result of that.
Yeah.
That's so powerful, Michael.
It is incredibly powerful. And I think what people they haven't seen yet, they haven't noticed, is that it's actually kind of obvious that if you're not running around with your hair on fire, if you're not constantly under pressure and feeling stressed, but you are engaged, you are actively engaged in what you're doing, of course you're going to do better. Like, that's obvious to a 5-year-old. And yet we're just so inculcated that, well, that's just part of work.
Mm-hmm.
That it doesn't have to be. And we don't succeed because of it. We succeed sometimes in spite of it.
Yes. When you and I talked earlier, and I asked you about an important message for leaders, one of the things you mentioned was the misunderstanding around being real. Would you talk about that, please? Because I think that's so important. It ties in with how we're showing up, how we're thinking, and who we're being with our teams and with everybody that encounters us.
So I will be really honest and say, I don't remember what I meant then, but I'll tell you what that means to me now, and hopefully it'll be just as good. There's a word that is most people know differently to how I'm going to use it, which is ego. And most people think of ego as arrogance. But when I talk about ego, I'm talking about our image of self, our self-image, how we see ourselves, how we want others to see us, how we want to not be seen, how we want to not see ourselves. And most of us have learned to work and live in a way to preserve, create an image of self that we like the look of. And I sometimes describe it, perhaps a little crudely, as we're all diamonds covered in horse shit, like all our thinking that's just not helpful. But we don't want anyone to see how full of shit we are. So we coat the whole thing in nail polish and go, look, it's fine. Right? Well, that nail polish is our self-image. And we try to present ourselves to the world in a certain way. We dress for success. We use our bluffer's guide to fitting into our industry. We act the way we want to be seen. We fake it till we make it. The problem in all of that is that all of our energy is going into preserving our self-image. And when it looks like it is under threat, we feel like we are under threat. So we tend to live in a state of fear, and we don't want people to get too close, and we don't want to appear honest or vulnerable, we want to appear honest and vulnerable. We just don't want to actually be honest and vulnerable. And so all of this energy that could be spent on creating whatever it is we create, selling whatever it is we sell, growing whatever it is we grow, is spent instead on preserving an imaginary image. So what most people don't realize, what I know I didn't realize until I started to realize it, is that if you drop your image of self, if you just drop it, who you actually are is amazing. Who you actually are is breathtakingly capable. Who you actually are has so much power and humor and compassion and creativity and insight that you really are fit to lead. But you don't even notice because you're so busy preserving and perfecting the mask, preserving and perfecting the image, preserving and perfecting the persona. And it's just amazing when you meet a leader who is themselves. That doesn't mean, well, I'm just being myself as an excuse to be a jerk. It's not about not adapting your behavior to be appropriate to the people you're speaking with. It's not about not having like all of that's fine. It's about not trying to be somebody and actually being who you are. And it's shocking how powerful that is.
The question that's coming to mind as I'm listening to you is for someone who has been maintaining that persona for a long time, how do they discover who they really are? How do they get to that diamond?
So I've found a couple of things that help. So I just offered these as might help, can't hurt, right? One is to think about times when they felt most themselves. They might not have been at work. They might have been with one or two people. They might feel most themselves around their partner. They might feel most themselves when they're off playing golf. They might feel most themselves when they're away from work, or there might be certain bits of work. But we've all had a taste of that. We all know that feeling of we're just being ourselves. There's no airs or graces. There's no false humility or false pride. It's just us, and we're okay. So most people, if you talk to them, they can find that. The other is just to say, find a place where you feel safe and try it. Go to the grocery store as yourself. And what that means is just if you notice yourself trying to look good in the grocery store, or hoping you're not seen buying junk food because you what, like, just as soon as you notice it, just drop it. And it's because you're always there. You've never actually gone anywhere. You find yourself quite quickly. And the more of a feel you get for the difference, the more intolerable it becomes to be the character, to be the persona. You get to a point where it's like, ugh, I can't believe that costume ever fit me. And it's not, because people think, oh, well, but who I really am is a worthless piece of crap. Who I really am is a scared little boy or girl. Who I really am, they don't want to do it because they think that's who they really are. But that's the layer of horse crap.
Mm.
That's not them either. Who you are, and this is my way of connecting to it. Who you are is the divine energy of life and form. You're the creative potential of the entire universe localized in a human being. That's not a bad thing. And it will come out very differently in you than it does in me. Right? Everything you do is going to be Meredith flavored. Everything I do is going to be Michael flavored. But Michael and Meredith are like a spice that brings out the flavor of the food. A little goes a long way. You don't want to put so much Michael in it that it tastes of Michael. A bit of Michael will bring it out, and a bit of Meredith will bring it out. And your work, your company, if you run a company, will take on that flavor. And it becomes such an authentic expression without having to try to be authentic or show everybody how authentic you are, which is just another version of putting your attention on the nail polish, on the image, on the persona, instead of just being who you are.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. One thing I want to cover with you, because it's something you talk about, I think you even have a group around it, this whole thing of fear, because fear feels real.
Yeah.
I mean, there are times when it's appropriate to be really afraid, but there are other times that fear can paralyze us because, again, it's related to our thoughts.
Yeah.
Share your ideas around fear.
Well, my ideas around fear have been forged from being a lifelong scaredy cat. Right? Like I was just always scared growing up. And I learned to manage it. I learned to feel the fear and do it anyways. I learned to be brave and then hide under a sofa. Like I found my way. And I thought that was as good as it was going to get. Like I thought that the opposite of fear was brave. Brave's not the opposite of fear. Brave's just carrying on when you're scared. What I started to see was that there's a difference between the feeling we call fear and awareness of danger. Awareness of danger is biological. It's built into the mechanism. It actually, when you have awareness of danger, you get hyper alert, you get surprisingly fast and strong and sharp. Your vision narrows so that you can handle the threat at hand. It's actually kind of a cool feeling, to the point where extreme athletes do more and more extreme stuff because they love that feeling of heightened presence that comes with genuine awareness of danger. What we call fear is just worry. What 99.9% of what we say is scary is us thinking things that we don't want to have happen and scaring ourselves with that. Yeah, but imagine if this happened. Yeah, but imagine if that happened. Yeah, but remember when that happened? And that feels, yeah. And we can create that same sense of heightened autonomic arousal, but it's nothing to do with anything. It's to do with that's what it feels like to scare yourself with imaginary scenarios that you don't like the sound of. And because there's a difference between the two, and you can learn to sense the difference between the two, awareness of danger, you'd want to get rid of that. But it's also rarely relevant in business. Like it's not, it doesn't come up that often. That feeling that we call fear, that's just letting you know, oh, I'm using my imagination to scare myself right now.
Hmm.
And I don't have to. I can use my imagination differently, or I can put my imagination down and get present. And yeah, the feelings might stick in my body for a while because once I've triggered the adrenaline response, the noradrenaline response, like in the cortisol response, I'm going to feel icky for a little while. But that's just sensation in the body. That's just residual. That's like a hangover, right? Like if you didn't know what a hangover was, you could be excused for thinking you were going to die because it feels so awful. But if you know it's a hangover, it's like, I'm an idiot. I should never do that again. But I know this will be gone in a couple hours. Same thing with fear. If I know that I'm just feeling the after effects of scaring myself, of imagining things I don't want to have happen and using them to scare myself on the screen, then I can just be with the sensations and I don't have to do anything about them. They'll settle in a minute. I might not like them. I might go, oh, I wish I hadn't scared myself so long. But you're fine. And when people genuinely start to see that, because I understand that that might sound like, okay, so what I need to do is step one. But if you actually just see it, you start to see yourself doing it. You start to watch yourself winding yourself up, and it just stops looking like a good idea. Like nobody has ever come to me for all the different things people have come to me for help with over the last 35 years. Nobody has ever come to me and said, hey, can you help me stop? I got this bad habit. Oh, what's the habit? I'm continually poking myself in the eye with my pen. Like nobody's ever come to me with that because nobody has that habit because it's obviously a terrible idea. Right? It doesn't look like that's doing me any good. Fear looks like maybe it's helping me stay sharp. Pressure feels like maybe it's helping me be more successful and stay on track. Like those things we have as habits because we think they're helping us. If you actually see how useless they are, how counterproductive they are, they're pretty much on their way out. The thought might still come up, but it has less and less traction every time because it just looks like a terrible idea. And we tend not to poke ourselves in the eye with a pen. It's like, yeah, that doesn't look like a good idea to me. I'm out. And oh, you know what? Terrifying myself and then trying to be creative doesn't look like a good idea either. So I'm not going to do that. And putting a ton of pressure on myself until I feel helpless and then trying to go out there and do it doesn't seem like a good idea. So I'm going to stop doing that.
Love that. Because, as I'm listening to everything you've said, it's this whole idea of becoming more aware of our thoughts.
Well,
So
it's
we notice when we are scaring ourselves, the feelings.
noticing is your superpower. And it's not just noticing your thoughts as in analyzing the content of your thinking, because that you just wind up in a psychological muddle. It's noticing the fact that you think, not what you're thinking about. What you're thinking about is going to change all the time. But it's like, I'm off creating a scenario. Oh, I'm off creating another scenario. Oh, I'm off remembering a scenario. Oh, I'm off. You start to notice that and how much of the time you're off with the fairies. You're off in la la land. You're off in your imagination. And then you can always come right back home to yourself. And so the noticing is powerful, but it's not noting. It's just noticing. And that's where the magic happens.
I love the gentleness of, being kind to yourself, not judging, not criticizing or evaluating or rating, let's say, but instead just being with yourself and not making yourself right or wrong. That's one of the, to me, the beauties of the things you write and talk about. And some of what you said here, it's not necessarily overtly been said, but I think it's important for us to consider we don't have to judge ourselves. We really are okay as we are. But these years of programming,
Yeah.
things we were told, things we've told ourselves and have believed, and now we hold them.
We come by it honestly, right? Like
Yes.
it's not, you're not a bad person because you believed what everybody told you. It just worth checking to see if it's actually true.
Michael, thank you so much. Everything you've shared is just so thought-provoking in a good way to ponder, not spend energy worrying about how am I coming across, but just to be present with ourselves, I think is probably a key aspect. Is there anything else you would like to share that's occurred to you that we haven't talked about?
I think, and because I do think a lot because of what I do about if people only saw one thing, what would be the most helpful thing? And while everything that we've talked about I think is helpful, for me, being yourself is the single most powerful piece of advice. But knowing what that means,
Mm.
knowing that that's not being more of your image of yourself or acting more the way you act habitually when you're unconscious. It's no, the real you, the you who's always been there, but gets covered over with a lot of thinking from time to time. Because that you can do everything you think you should do and more, including knowing when not to.
That's a wonderful way to conclude. I really am so grateful for the time we've had together today and all the important and valuable insights you've shared. I want to really encourage my listeners to get the Inside Out Revolution because there's so much more. And watch Michael's videos and subscribe to his podcast,
No.
Caffeine for the Soul. Michael, how can people connect with you, learn more about your work? Because you have some wonderful programs that you offer also.
Well, michaelneill.org. I asked them years ago to make me a sandbox on the web where I could play. And so you can find everything. We do a lot of different things aimed at different people, but it's all the same thing. My daughter actually traveled with me for a year. She homeschooled for a bit. And she saw me give talks around the world. And she said it after like the 10th one. She said, Dad, does anybody notice that no matter what the subject of the talk is, you always talk about the same stuff? And I was like, yeah, I think they do, but it's really good stuff. So, so I was just point people to michaelneill.org and go explore. You'll find what you're looking for in there.
It's great. And we'll have all of that on the show notes page for your episode too. Thank you
Nice.
again, Michael, for who you are in the world, who you are to me and to so many others.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you, Meredith.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our 2 books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free facilitator guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.